Pravit moi druzy. Hello, my friends. My name is Darren Gerdes. I'm just a professor who's trying to help you provide context for what's going on in the war in Ukraine. So today I want to talk about what kind of sources you watch or pay attention to or read, and how to judge the sources and see if they're useful sources or whether you should even listen to them. Okay, so there was this great little article in the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War. This is one of my go-to sources, and it talked about its statement on the ISW methodology. Now, as a professor, this was very meaningful to me because I want to know that my sources are legitimate and be able to trace the sources to the actual facts themselves. Okay, so if you are doing kind of what the ISW is claiming that it is doing, then I think you have something. And if you're not doing that, maybe you should think about doing it. So it said the Institute for the Study of War welcomes a robust and rigorous debate. That's step one. You should be welcoming different points of view into the conversation so you're not in an echo chamber. That doesn't mean that you're approving of the other side, but that means that you're trying to factor in different messages so you can triangulate on what is true. A few key takeaways regarding ISW's approach. ISW applies rigorous intelligence tradecraft that reflects best practices drawn from the U.S. intelligence community. Now, when you hear that, you might say, I'm going to have the cutting edge Twitter or Telegram or whatever from the front lines. Don't do that. Be very careful. It's okay to hear that and factor that in, but you have to confirm those kind of things with other verifiable sources. ISW's extensive daily collection and analysis provides a highly tested baseline of existing patterns. Pattern recognition is very important. Pattern recognition, however, can go awry. So for example, and I've showed this before, spurious correlations. There's a whole website called Spurious Correlations. And this looks like there's a pattern between these two things, but it's total revenue generated by arcades and computer science doctorates awarded in the US. And that even sounds like it could be, but it's really not. It just happens to be at the same time. So pattern recognition alone doesn't actually work. Here's another one. Worldwide non-commercial space launches and sociology doctorates awarded in the US. This looks like a pattern, but it's really not. In fact, it's got great sources like the Federal Aviation Administration and National Science Foundation, but it's a spurious correlation. It doesn't really connect. Per capita consumption of mozzarella cheese and civil engineering doctorates awarded. Now, you know that this is not actually connected, but it kind of looks like it is. And finally, people who drowned after falling out of a fishing boat and the marriage rate in Kentucky. So again, it looks like it's connected, but it's not. So you got to be careful with patterns. But after a while, you'll start to see patterns. So pattern recognition is actually a useful instrument. And when I say patterns, over time, the more time that you spend on something, the more you start to recognize or understand. So I calculate that I've read somewhere between 6 and 12, a half dozen to a dozen articles per day since the beginning of the war. Well, if you add that up, that means I've read somewhere around 3,500 articles to date about what's going on in Ukraine. And when you do that, you start to recognize certain things. So that will help. But I don't have the same view as a historian who has a doctorate in Ukrainian history or history of that region or something along those lines. They've spent even more time than I've spent on it. So you have to be aware of that kind of thing. Okay. So there's the patterns, but the ISW's ability to make a judgment on a given piece of data is informed by its months of prior study. And that's what I was talking about with the historian. ISW is fully independent of the U.S. and foreign governments. That's a really good sign. Takes no money from these entities and is committed to its independence as a key source of objectivity. So where is the source coming from? If it's coming from Russian state media, it's dependent on Russia for its source, and so it's probably not a great source. If it's coming from even the U.S. government, I would be more inclined to listen to Radio Free Europe, but I want to triangulate that story with what the BBC or with what Reuters or AP News or somebody else is saying as well. ISW aims to inform, not convince. That's really, really good. If they're trying to persuade you that this happens to be the right thing and you ought to believe that, that's not necessarily as safe of a source as someone who's saying, look, I don't know what it is. I think it's this, and here's the reasons why I think it's that. Informing is different than trying to convince, and it tends to be more reliable. Audiences and makes available the sourcing of each product to ensure readers can engage directly with the underlying data. So they provide their sources, or do they show you their sources in the process? That's better than just somebody who's a talking head who says this is the way it is, that's why it's right, and but doesn't give you the sources. ISW analysts interpret available data to form assessments. They do not simply report facts. ISW explicitly states it is specific confidence level in each assessment, and that's really important, that they're saying, hey, I have a very high level of confidence in this, or this is just speculation, this may or may not be happening. And to be able to know the difference is very important. The ISW is committed to providing accurate, granular, and timely intelligence from open sources on a threat to the U.S. national security interest, including Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. The purpose of the ISW's work is to inform U.S. and allied decision makers, to educate public audiences. So something like the ISW, that's a think tank, is going to be far better of a source than, say, a media organization that's trying to sell newspapers, right? Because the tendency there is to be hyperbolic. And it's even worse in social media, because the tendency there is to get as many likes or hits. They're not trying to do that. They're trying to be objective, and their value comes in their objectivity. Independence and transparency are core ISW values. That's always good to look for. ISW is committed to informing, not convincing. That's kind of what I'm trying to do. We were talking about drones recently hitting Russia, hitting the Kremlin. Is it this or is it that? Here are the facts. I don't know. I have an inclination, but I'm not going to say until I have the actual evidence that I can point you to. I'm loath to say that. So that kind of demeanor or temperament is what you want to be looking for. ISW products do not simply report facts, but rather interpret available data to form assessments regarding what is occurring, has occurred, and could occur. Understanding the distinction between a fact and an assessment is critical for responsibly using ISW products, because assessments can be wrong, and that they say that is a healthy sign. And then finally, ISW explicitly states its specific confidence level whenever applicable, and encourages our readers to include it when reporting assessments. So if they're saying there's a very high level of confidence for all these reasons, or there's a low level of confidence, but this is what might be happening, and showing the difference is very good. Okay, so I hope that helps you understand how you should be thinking about the sources that you watch or listen to or read, because this is too important to get wrong. You are on the cutting edge of, if you're listening to me right now, and you're probably the kind of person that's listening to other assessments about what's going on with the war between Russia and Ukraine, you're on that cutting edge of information. There's an entire array of propaganda coming from the Russians out to change the information. And there's a counter to that from the Ukrainians trying to say, no, no, these are the facts. And it gets murky. And if you're on social media, there's an echo chamber. And so you want to make sure that you're as informed as possible. Thank you for listening to me now, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.